today we are going to learn about the neurons, so the three different types of neurons that we have, and the structure and function of that neuron, so what it actually is for. So within the brain, or within our whole body really, communication happens via the neurons. So the neurons talk to each other, and they're, I guess, like the little messengers that deliver all the messages throughout our bodies for us. So we've got three key types. We've got our sensory neuron, we've got our motor neuron, and then we've got what we call our interneuron. And they each serve a different function for us in terms of our nervous system functioning and just our functioning as human beings, really. So our sensory neuron, essentially, all neurons are specialized nerve cells. Okay, so they're things that travel around the entire body and allow it to talk to itself. So a sensory neuron is a specialized nerve cell that only interprets sensory information. Okay, so that's information coming from our five senses. So sight, sound, smell, taste, touch. All right, so essentially what it does is it receives and it carries that sensory information, and it only ever travels towards the brain. Okay, so our sensory neurons pick up on pain, taste, temperature, pressure, all of those kinds of things, and it sends that information up towards the brain. Okay, so via our afferent pathway that goes up towards the brain. Our second type of neuron is called our motor neuron. So our motor neuron is a specialized specialized nerve cell that is responsible for communicating with the muscles, okay? So skeletal muscles and visceral muscles. So visceral muscles are those attached to organs, skeletal is the ones attached to our skeleton. So skeleton what allows us to move. So the skeletal muscles essentially are coordinated by our somatic, and our visceral muscles more often than not are coordinated by the peripheral nervous system, or the autonomic nervous system, autonomic branch of the peripheral. So with our motor neuron, what it does is it causes our muscles to either contract or relax. So we're either going to relax our muscles when we don't want to use that part of our body, or they're contracting when we're using it. All right. Then finally what we have is we have our interneuron. So realistically, for the purposes of VCE psychology and what you need to know, our sensory and our motor neurons can't talk directly to each other. They need to have a translator that helps them to coordinate and to actually talk to one another. And the interneuron acts as that translator, okay? So the interneuron is found mostly in our brain, so it's that we have an abundant amount in our brain, and you can understand why. The sensory neuron carries the message to the brain interprets that message and decides how it should respond, and the brain then sends the message via the motor back out. Okay, so there's obviously a reason why we've got the most interneurons in the brain, because that's where that communication needs to happen when we're making that decision. So essentially it acts as the translator between motor and sensory. That's its only function, really. So that's why also this is predominantly in central nervous system. So we know we've got some as we'll learn about in the spinal reflex, we do have them in the spine, but essentially we find them in the most abundance in the brain. So what we're going to do is quickly go over the structure of a neuron, okay, and its function. So they're all structured slightly differently, as you can see, all right? So a motor neuron, all neurons essentially will have these key structures. So we've got our dendrites, which is this part of the neuron that receives the information, okay? So it's important to understand that neurons are all electrical, okay? So they run on an electrical impulse. They're electrical messages. So we can only have that electrical impulse traveling in one direction, and that one direction is what we call our action potential. So essentially it works like a chain. Okay, so the dendrites is the first part of that chain. The dendrites is what receives all the incoming information from other neurons. So you can see we've got lots of them, and there can be lots more coming off here than what's drawn. So the dendrites receive the information and sends it all into this cell body here in the middle that we call our soma. So the soma then integrates all of that information that it's received and sends it to the axon to be delivered. Okay, so it's gonna draw it all in and interpret what it means and interpret what the neuron should be responding to, and it then sends that information down what we call the axon. So the axon is this tube-like structure in the middle, okay? And essentially that carries the information. That's what carries what we call our action potential, and that's the electrical impulse. So this sort of the orangey circular stuff is what we call our myelin sheath. So our myelin sheath is like a big fatty substance that surrounds the axon and protects it. Okay, so it provides it with insulation. It also makes sure that it allows that message to travel really, really quickly, and it prevents any interruptions. So it means any other sort of electrical impulses that are happening within the brain or the body isn't interrupting the role of that one neuron. So we've had the information come in via the dendrites, it's been integrated by our soma and is now travelling down our axon, which is nicely protected by our myelin sheath. Then what it's going to reach is what we call our axon terminals. So the axon terminals are these fun little guys down at the end, they're a bit tentacle-like, and essentially this is where we store what we call neurotransmitters, particularly in these little buds on the end here, which we call our terminal buttons. So that's the place that stores and then secretes or sends out all of our neurotransmitters. And neurotransmitters is actually the way in which neurons communicate with each other. Okay, so two neurons will never actually connect. They might be close to one another, but they don't actually join. The way that they communicate is via what we call a neurotransmitter. And a neurotransmitter is a chemical substance that passes across the synapse, which is the gap between the two neurons, and is then absorbed by the next neuron. And that's what's responsible for carrying the message. Okay, that's what sends the messages of the action we want these neurons to take. So the dendrite is responsible for absorbing the neurotransmitter from other neurons. The soma coordinates the messages those neurotransmitters have, sends it down the axon towards the axon terminal to then activate this neuron to send out whatever neurotransmitters it needs to its next neuron to communicate. Okay, so all of these neurons have those structures. So in a sensory neuron, we have the sensory receptor, which is the big bud on top, which acts like a dendrite. It either is going to pick up on sensory information, so pain, cold, flavour, any of those things. It travels down the axon. You can see the action potential. It can only travel in one direction to the axon terminals to then release its neurotransmitter. Again, with our interneuron, we've got the dendrites at the top. The action potential travels in one direction into the axon terminal. All right, so we know then that our CNS needs to communicate with the PNS to make us all integrated in terms of how we function. And it's the neurons that are the vehicles that allow us to do that. So these are our little masters of communication that enables everything to talk to one another.